Marcus Blackwood stepped out of his black Bentley, adjusting his $1,000 suit jacket as the cool London morning air hit his face. At 42 years old, Marcus had built a technology empire worth over $2 billion, and he made sure everyone knew it. His perfectly styled hair, expensive watch, and arrogant smirk were all carefully crafted to display his wealth and status. "Stay here," he commanded his driver without looking back, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had never been told no. Marcus was in London for a business meeting that would potentially add another $100 million to his fortune. But first, he wanted to play tourist at Buckingham Palace. As he approached the famous gates, Marcus pulled out his phone and began taking selfies. The morning crowd was already gathering, tourists from around the world eager to catch a glimpse of the changing of the guard ceremony. Marcus pushed through the crowd with no regard for others, his expensive shoes clicking against the pavement as he made his way to the front. "Excuse me, sir, please stay behind the barriers," said a police officer politely, gesturing to the rope that kept tourists at a safe distance from the guards. Marcus barely glanced at the officer. "Do you know who I am?" he sneered, continuing to step closer to where the royal guard stood at attention. "I didn't fly halfway around the world to stand behind some cheap rope." The police officer, a young man named James who had been working this beat for 3 years, maintained his professional demeanor. "I understand, sir, but these are the rules for everyone's safety and security." "Rules are for poor people," Marcus replied with a dismissive wave of his hand. He had said this phrase so many times that it had become his personal motto. In his world of private jets, exclusive clubs, and unlimited access, Marcus had never encountered a rule that his money couldn't bend or break. Standing just 20 feet away was Guardsman William Matthews, a 25-year-old member of the Grenadier Guards. William stood perfectly still in his iconic red tunic and bearskin hat, his face expressionless as he had been trained. He had been serving as a royal guard for 3 years, and in that time, he had witnessed countless tourists trying to get his attention, take photos with him, or make him break his stoic pose. William came from a military family. His father had served in the Royal Navy, and his grandfather had been a guardsman before him. For William, this wasn't just a job or a tourist attraction. It was a sacred duty to protect the crown and uphold centuries of tradition. Every morning, he put on his uniform with pride, knowing he was part of something much larger than himself. Marcus noticed William standing there and saw an opportunity for the perfect photo. He pulled out his latest iPhone and began taking pictures, getting closer and closer to the guard. Other tourists watched nervously as Marcus crossed boundaries that everyone else respected. "Hey, soldier boy!" Marcus called out loudly, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Look this way. I want a good picture for my Instagram." William remained motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead as his training demanded. Royal guards were taught to ignore distractions no matter how persistent or annoying they might be. This only frustrated Marcus more. "I'm talking to you," Marcus said, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. "Do you know how much tax money I pay? You work for me, basically." The crowd around them began to murmur, sensing the tension building. Several tourists started recording with their phones, though they weren't sure what they were witnessing yet. Marcus's sense of entitlement was becoming more apparent with each passing moment. Officer James approached again, his patience wearing thin but his professionalism intact. "Sir, I really must insist that you respect the boundaries and keep your voice down. This is a place of respect and tradition." Marcus turned on the officer with fury in his eyes. "Don't you dare tell me to keep my voice down. I've donated more money to charities in this country than you'll make in your entire worthless career." "I deserve respect." The crowd was growing larger, and more people were pulling out their phones. In today's connected world, dramatic moments like this could spread across social media in minutes. Marcus, however, was too caught up in his own anger to notice or care about the potential consequences of his behavior. "You want to see what real power looks like?" Marcus shouted, his face red with rage. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick wad of cash. "This is what matters in the real world, not your silly costumes and outdated traditions." He began waving the money around, trying to shove it toward William's face. "Come on, toy soldier. I know you want this. Everyone has a price. What's yours?" William's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his position. In his peripheral vision, he could see more guards taking notice of the situation, though protocol dictated they should not move unless there was a direct threat to security. Marcus's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. The business meeting that had brought him to London was worth a fortune, and the stress of the negotiations, combined with his natural arrogance, was pushing him toward a breaking point he didn't even realize he was approaching. "Fine," Marcus snarled when William continued to ignore him. "If you won't take my money, maybe this will get your attention." What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms around the world. Marcus, in a moment of pure rage and entitlement, gathered saliva in his mouth and spat directly at guardsman William Matthews. The thick spit hit William's red tunic, leaving a visible stain on the pristine uniform that represented centuries of honor and tradition. For a moment, the entire courtyard fell silent. Even the other tourists stopped talking, shocked by what they had just witnessed. William's hands, which had been steady as rocks, began to tremble slightly. His breathing became deeper, more controlled, as he fought every instinct in his body that wanted to respond to this ultimate act of disrespect. The spit was slowly sliding down his uniform, a visible reminder of the humiliation he was being forced to endure. Officer James immediately stepped forward, his hand moving toward his radio. "Sir, you need to come with me right now. That is assault on a member of Her Majesty's Guard." But Marcus wasn't finished. The power he felt from finally getting a reaction was intoxicating. "What are you going to do about it?" he taunted, stepping even closer to William. "I can buy and sell all of you. My lawyers will have me out before dinner." The crowd was now openly recording everything, their phones capturing every word and gesture. Several tourists were backing away, uncomfortable with the escalating situation, while others pressed closer, drawn by the drama unfolding before them. Marcus reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out his business card. "Marcus Blackwood. Blackwood Technologies," he announced loudly. "Look it up. I'm worth more than this entire block. Your little guard here just learned what happens when poor people don't show proper respect to their betters." He threw the business card at William's feet, where it landed next to a puddle from the morning rain. The white card with gold lettering seemed to mock everything the guard stood for: duty, honor, service, and tradition. William's eyes remained fixed forward, but inside his mind was racing. He thought about his grandfather, who had served with distinction for 30 years. He thought about his father, who had taught him that a man's character was measured not by his wealth, but by how he treated others when he thought no one was watching. Most of all, he thought about the uniform he wore and what it represented to millions of people around the world. The bearskin hat on his head had been worn by guardsmen who had served through 2 world wars, who had protected kings and queens, who had maintained their posts during air raids and terrorist attacks. The red tunic had been earned through months of rigorous training, through dedication and sacrifice that Marcus could never understand. More police officers were arriving now, drawn by Officer James's radio call. The situation was clearly escalating beyond a simple tourist disruption. Marcus seemed to interpret the additional attention as validation of his importance rather than a sign that he was in serious trouble. "That's right," he called out to the arriving officers. "This is how you treat someone who actually matters. I hope you're all getting good pictures for your social media." He pulled out his phone and began taking selfies with William in the background, making sure to capture the spit stain on the guard's uniform. To Marcus, this was a trophy, proof of his power and superiority. He had no idea that these same images would soon become evidence in a case that would change his life forever. The head of palace security, a stern woman named Inspector Sarah Chen, arrived on the scene with a team of specially trained officers. Inspector Chen had been responsible for protecting the royal family and their properties for over 15 years, and she had seen every type of security threat imaginable. But what she was witnessing now was something different. Not a terrorist attack or a mental health crisis, but pure, unadulterated arrogance that had crossed the line into criminal behavior. "Mr. Terravis Blackwood," Inspector Chen said, her voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "I need you to step away from the guard immediately." Marcus turned to face her, his expression showing annoyance at being interrupted. "And you are?" "Inspector Chen, head of palace security. You are currently under investigation for assault on a member of the Royal Guard, and I strongly advise you to cooperate with our officers." For the first time since his arrival, Marcus seemed to register that this situation might be more serious than he had anticipated. However, his arrogance quickly reasserted itself. "Investigation?" he laughed. "For what? Teaching some kid in a costume about reality? Please. My legal team will have this nonsense dismissed before you can file the paperwork." Inspector Chen's expression didn't change, but several officers around her exchanged glances. They had dealt with entitled individuals before, but Marcus's complete lack of awareness about the gravity of his situation was remarkable even by their standards. The crowd of tourists continued to grow, and many were now streaming the events live on various social media platforms. Ash Royal Guard assault was already beginning to trend on Twitter, though Marcus remained oblivious to the digital storm he was creating. William, still standing at attention despite everything that had happened, could hear the murmur of the crowd and the click of cameras. He knew that this moment would define not just his own career, but potentially the public's perception of the Royal Guard itself. The weight of responsibility he felt was enormous, but his training and personal convictions kept him steady. Marcus was still talking, his voice growing louder as he tried to maintain control of the situation. "Do you people understand that I could buy this entire palace if I wanted to? I have meetings with world leaders. I employ thousands of people. And you're worried about some spit on a costume?" His words were being broadcast live to thousands of viewers around the world, each statement adding to the growing public outrage. Comments were pouring in faster than the social media platforms could process them, and news outlets were already beginning to pick up the story. Inspector Chen made a subtle gesture to her officers, who began to position themselves around Marcus. "Mr. Trabb's opposing Dr. Shaw. Blackwood, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The formal beginning of his arrest seemed to snap Marcus partially back to reality. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice finally showing a hint of uncertainty. "This is ridiculous. I want to speak to the American ambassador immediately." "You'll have that opportunity," Inspector Chen replied evenly, "after you've been processed according to British law." As the officers moved closer, Marcus made one final gesture of defiance. He pulled out his wallet, thick with credit cards and cash, and waved it in the air. "This is what real power looks like," he shouted to the crowd and the cameras, "not some medieval costume party." The irony was lost on Marcus that his real power was about to prove completely powerless against the ancient traditions and modern laws he had just violated. His wealth, which had always been his shield against consequences, was about to become irrelevant in a way he had never experienced. The last thing the crowd heard before Marcus was led away was his voice, still defiant, still convinced of his own superiority. "You'll all regret this when my lawyers get involved. I'll own half of London before this is over." As the police car drove away with Marcus in the back seat, Guardsman William Matthews remained at his post, the stain still visible on his uniform. The crowd began to disperse, but many tourists stayed, taking photos and discussing what they had just witnessed. For them, it had been better than any planned entertainment. Officer James approached William, speaking quietly so only the guard could hear. "We got it all on camera, mate. Multiple angles. He's not getting away with this." William gave the slightest nod, the only acknowledgement he could provide while on duty. Inside, he felt a mixture of humiliation and pride. Humiliation at being treated with such disrespect, but pride in maintaining his composure under the most difficult circumstances he had ever faced as a guard. The morning shift was only half over, but William knew this day would be remembered for the rest of his career. He also knew that somewhere in London, Marcus Blackwood was about to discover that money couldn't buy respect, and it certainly couldn't erase the consequences of his actions. The crowd finally began to thin out, but the story was just beginning. Across social media platforms, the videos were being shared thousands of times per minute. News organizations were scrambling to verify the details and get statements from witnesses. The palace press office was preparing for what they knew would be a media firestorm. Marcus Blackwood had wanted attention and respect. He was about to get more attention than he had ever imagined, but it would be the opposite of respect. His moment of arrogance had been captured forever, and the world was watching. The Belgravia police station was not what Marcus Blackwood expected when he imagined his first encounter with British law enforcement. The building was old but well-maintained, with that distinctly British blend of tradition and modern efficiency that seemed to characterize everything in London. As he was led through the front entrance in handcuffs, Marcus still believed this was all a terrible misunderstanding that would be resolved within the hour. "This is completely absurd," he muttered to Detective Inspector Margaret Wells, a woman in her late 40s who had been assigned to his case. "I have a business meeting worth hundreds of millions of dollars." "The case? You're costing me money every minute I'm stuck in this place." Detective Inspector Wells had seen many wealthy individuals come through these doors over her 20-year career, but few with Marcus's level of arrogance. She guided him through the booking process with professional efficiency, noting how he continued to demand special treatment at every step. "I need to call my lawyer immediately," Marcus insisted as they took his fingerprints. "This is harassment, and I'll make sure everyone involved faces consequences." "You'll have your phone call after processing is complete," Detective Wells replied calmly. She had dealt with enough entitled suspects to know that maintaining her composure was crucial. That includes photographing, fingerprinting, and securing your personal belongings. The photography session was particularly humiliating for Marcus. He was used to carefully staged photos for business magazines and social media, where every detail was controlled to project success and power. The police booking photos were harsh and unflattering, capturing him at his worst moment with disheveled hair and anger etched across his face. "You can't use these photos," he demanded. "I have image rights. I'll sue this entire department." The booking officer, a patient man named Sergeant Robert Hayes, had heard similar threats countless times. "These are official police records, Mr. Blackwood. They're not for public distribution, but they are part of the legal process." What Marcus didn't realize was that the photos taken by tourists outside Buckingham Palace were already spreading like wildfire across the internet. While he worried about police booking photos, millions of people were seeing high-definition videos of his assault on the Royal Guard, captured from multiple angles by dozens of smartphones. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, the aftermath of the incident was being handled with military precision. Guardsman William Matthews had been quietly replaced by another guard so he could clean his uniform and file his official report. The palace staff moved efficiently to restore normalcy, but the damage to the morning's atmosphere was already done. In a small office within the palace walls, William sat across from Captain James Morrison, his commanding officer. Captain Morrison was a career military man who had served in Afghanistan and Iraq before accepting his current position. He understood the unique challenges that came with being a public-facing member of the Royal Guard. "How are you feeling about what happened out there, Matthews?" Captain Morrison asked, his tone supportive but professional. William straightened in his chair, still maintaining the discipline that defined every aspect of his military service. "I'm fine, sir. The individual was clearly attempting to provoke a reaction, and I maintained my post as required." "You did exactly what you should have done," Captain Morrison confirmed. "But I want you to know that what happened was completely unacceptable, and there will be consequences for Mr. Blackwood." The captain pulled out a tablet and showed William some of the social media posts that were already circulating. "The public response has been overwhelming. People are outraged by what they saw, and they're showing tremendous support for you and the Guard." William looked at the screen with surprise. He could see thousands of comments from people around the world expressing their disgust with Marcus's behavior and their admiration for his professionalism. The hashtag #RespectTheGuard was trending globally, with posts coming in multiple languages from supporters worldwide. "I never expected this level of attention," William admitted. "I was just doing my job. And that's exactly why people are responding so positively," Captain Morrison explained. "You represented everything the Royal Guard stands for: duty, honor, and dignity under pressure." Back at the police station, Marcus was finally allowed to make his phone call. He immediately contacted his head of legal affairs, a sharp attorney named Richard Pemberton who specialized in crisis management for wealthy clients. "Richard, thank God," Marcus said into the phone, his voice betraying his first real hint of anxiety. "I'm in some ridiculous situation in London. They arrested me for essentially nothing, and I need you to get me out of here immediately." Richard Pemberton had been practicing law for 30 years. And he had built his reputation on getting powerful people out of difficult situations. However, as Marcus explained what had happened, Richard felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. "Marcus," Richard interrupted, "please tell me you didn't actually spit on a British royal guard." "It was barely anything," Marcus replied dismissively. "A little spit on a costume. These people are acting like I committed murder." Richard closed his eyes and took a deep breath. In his experience, when wealthy clients described their actions as barely anything, the reality was usually much worse. "Marcus, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do not say another word to anyone until I get there. Not to police, not to other prisoners, not to anyone. Do you understand?" The urgency in his lawyer's voice finally penetrated Marcus's arrogance. "You're scaring me, Richard. Just fix this." "I'll do everything I can," Richard replied, "but you need to understand that this is not going to be simple. Assaulting a royal guard is a serious offense in the UK, and if there's video evidence, there might be some tourist videos," Marcus admitted reluctantly. Richard felt his heart sink further. "How many tourists?" "I don't know. Maybe a dozen? Maybe more?" Marcus was beginning to realize that his assumption about easy resolution might have been optimistic. After hanging up the phone, Marcus was led to a holding cell where he would wait for his lawyer's arrival. The cell was clean but stark, a dramatic contrast to the luxury hotel suite where he had started his morning. For the first time in years, Marcus was in a place where his wealth meant absolutely nothing. While Marcus sat in his cell, the story was exploding across the internet. The initial videos posted by tourists had been picked up by news organizations around the world. CNN, BBC, Fox News, and dozens of other major outlets were running the story as breaking news. The palace's press office was fielding hundreds of calls from journalists seeking official comment. Press Secretary Victoria Hamilton had worked in royal communications for over a decade, but she had never dealt with anything quite like this. "We can confirm that an incident occurred this morning involving a tourist and a member of the Royal Guard," she stated in the official press release. "The individual in question has been arrested by the Metropolitan Police, and we have full confidence in the British justice system to handle this matter appropriately." The carefully worded statement was designed to avoid inflaming the situation while making it clear that the palace took the incident seriously. However, the public reaction was far more intense than any official statement. On Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, the videos were being shared millions of times. Comments poured in from people expressing their outrage at Marcus's behavior and their admiration for the guard's professionalism. Many users were researching Marcus's background, finding details about his business empire and previous controversies. The hashtag #MarcusBlackwoodShame began trending alongside #RespectTheGuard as internet users shared their opinions about the incident. Corporate social media accounts began distancing themselves from Marcus, with several business partners issuing statements about reviewing their relationships with Blackwood Technologies. At his office in New York, Richard Pemberton was working frantically to understand the full scope of what his client had created. His team of assistants was monitoring social media, gathering video evidence, and researching British law regarding assaults on royal guards. "How bad is it?" Richard asked his chief researcher, a brilliant young attorney named Sarah Chen. Sarah looked up from her computer with a grim expression. "It's bad, Richard. Really bad. I count at least 30 different videos from multiple angles. Audio is clear on most of them. His voice, his words, everything is captured in high definition." She pulled up one of the videos and played it for Richard. As he watched Marcus's arrogant behavior culminating in the spitting incident, Richard realized this case would be unlike anything he had handled before. "What's the legal exposure in the UK for this type of assault?" he asked. Sarah had been researching British law for the past 2 hours. Assault on a royal guard can carry up to 6 months in prison, plus significant fines. "But Richard, that's not the worst part." "What do you mean?" "The public reaction is intense. This isn't just a legal problem anymore. It's a public relations nightmare of epic proportions. His business is being attacked online, partners are backing away, and the story is still growing." Richard rubbed his temples, feeling the beginning of a headache that he knew would last for days. In 30 years of practice, he had never seen a client create such a perfect storm of legal and public relations disasters in a single morning. Meanwhile, at his company's headquarters in Silicon Valley, the Blackwood Technologies executive team was in crisis mode. Marcus's assistant, Jennifer Walsh, had been fielding calls from reporters, business partners, and board members all morning. "Where is he?" demanded board chairman David Sterling, a man who had invested heavily in the company and had little patience for Marcus's personal dramas affecting business. "He's in London for the Morrison deal," Jennifer replied nervously. "But I think there's been some kind of incident." David pulled up his phone and showed Jennifer the trending videos. "Some kind of incident? Jennifer, he assaulted a British Royal Guard on video. This is going to destroy us." The Morrison deal that had brought Marcus to London was worth over $200 million, an acquisition that would have significantly expanded Blackwood Technologies' presence in the European market. David Sterling immediately called the Morrison Group's CEO to gauge their reaction to the morning's events. "David," came the cool voice of Morrison Group CEO Elizabeth Morrison, "I assume you're calling about your Mr. Blackwood's performance in London this morning. Elizabeth, I want you to know that Marcus's personal behavior does not reflect the values of our company," David began, but Elizabeth cut him off. "David, we've been doing business together for 15 years, and I respect you enormously, but we cannot proceed with this deal while Mr. Blackwood remains the face of your company. Our board met an hour ago, and we're unanimous on this." David felt his heart sink. The Morrison deal had been in development for over 2 years, and losing it would cost the company not just the immediate revenue, but potentially dozens of other European partnerships. "Elizabeth, please, let's not make any hasty decisions. This will blow over in a few days." "I don't think you understand the scope of what's happening," Elizabeth replied. "This isn't going to blow over. Your CEO just became one of the most hated people on the internet, and our brand cannot be associated with that." After the call ended, David Sterling sat in his office staring out at the Silicon Valley landscape that had made Marcus Blackwood incredibly wealthy. He realized that all of that wealth might not be enough to save Marcus from the consequences of his actions in London. Back in his holding cell, Marcus was slowly beginning to understand that his usual methods of solving problems weren't working. He had always believed that any situation could be resolved with enough money and the right connections, but the walls of the jail cell were not impressed by his net worth. A young police constable brought him a cup of tea and a sandwich, treating him with professional courtesy but no special deference. To the constable, Marcus was just another suspect awaiting processing, regardless of his claims about his wealth and importance. "When will my lawyer arrive?" Marcus asked, his voice showing more anxiety than he had ever allowed himself to display in business situations. "He's flying in from the United States," the constable replied. "Should be several more hours at least." Several more hours. Marcus had never waited several hours for anything in his adult life. His private jet could take him anywhere in the world on a moment's notice. His staff anticipated his needs before he expressed them. His wealth had insulated him from the ordinary inconveniences that affected regular people. Now, sitting in a British jail cell with nothing but his thoughts, Marcus was forced to confront the possibility that his money might not be able to fix this situation. For the first time in decades, he was completely powerless. Outside, the story continued to grow. International news networks were running segments about the incident, with legal experts discussing the potential consequences Marcus faced. British talk shows were dedicating entire segments to analyzing the videos and discussing what the incident said about wealth, privilege, and respect for tradition. The Royal Guard had become a symbol of dignity under pressure, while Marcus had become a symbol of everything people disliked about entitled wealthy individuals. The contrast couldn't have been more stark, and the court of public opinion had already reached its verdict. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus's situation continued to deteriorate. What had started as a minor tourist incident had become an international controversy, and he was at the center of it all, powerless to control the narrative for the first time in his adult life. The wealthy businessman who had woken up that morning believing he could buy and sell anything he wanted was learning that respect, dignity, and reputation were things that money could destroy but could never purchase. Richard Pemberton's flight from New York to London gave him 8 hours to study every piece of evidence his team had gathered about Marcus Blackwood's incident. As one of America's most expensive defense attorneys, Richard had handled cases involving celebrities, politicians, and billionaires, but he had never seen anything quite like this. His tablet was filled with dozens of video clips from different angles, each one showing Marcus's behavior in excruciating detail. The audio quality was crystal clear, capturing every arrogant word, every dismissive gesture, and most damaging of all, the moment when he spat on Guardsman William Matthews. "This is going to be brutal," Richard muttered to himself as he watched the footage for the 20th time. His legal assistant, Michael Torres, was working beside him, compiling a list of all the potential charges Marcus might face. "The assault charge is definitely solid," Michael said, pulling up British legal statutes on his laptop. "But there's also possible charges of public disorder, harassment, and something called behavior likely to cause harassment, alarm, or distress." Richard nodded grimly. British law took public order very seriously, especially when it came to incidents involving the royal family or their guards. What's the maximum exposure if they throw everything at him? If convicted on all charges, he could face up to 18 months in prison, plus substantial fines and potential deportation, Michael replied. "And, Richard, that's just the legal consequences." They both knew that the legal troubles were only part of Marcus's problems. The business consequences were already mounting, and they would likely be far more devastating than any criminal penalties. While Richard flew across the Atlantic, the situation in London was escalating beyond anyone's expectations. The videos of Marcus's behavior had now been viewed over 50 million times across various social media platforms. News organizations were running the story as their lead item, and talk shows were dedicating entire episodes to discussing the incident. At Buckingham Palace, the response was being carefully coordinated by the Royal Communications team. Press Secretary Victoria Hamilton was working closely with the palace's head of security and the Royal Guard's commanding officers to manage the unprecedented level of media attention. "We need to strike the right balance," Victoria explained to her team during an emergency meeting. "We want to show support for our guards without appearing to influence the legal process." The Queen's private secretary, Sir Anthony Hartwell, had been monitoring the situation closely. In his 40 years of royal service, he had managed countless crises, but the global reach of social media made this incident uniquely challenging. "The public response has been remarkably supportive of the Guard," Sir Anthony noted, reviewing reports from around the world. "We're receiving messages of support from military organizations, government officials, and ordinary citizens in dozens of countries. Indeed, the support for Guardsman William Matthews was overwhelming." Military veterans were sharing their own stories of maintaining dignity under pressure. Government officials from various countries were making statements supporting the professionalism of the Royal Guard. Even celebrities were weighing in, with several high-profile figures posting messages of support for William and criticism of Marcus's behavior. William himself was struggling to process the attention. As a private person who had chosen military service partly to avoid the spotlight, finding himself at the center of a global news story was deeply uncomfortable. "I just want to get back to my normal duties," he told Captain Morrison during their afternoon meeting. "All this attention feels wrong. I was just doing my job." Captain Morrison understood William's discomfort, but he also recognized the broader significance of what had happened. "William, whether you like it or not, you've become a symbol of something important. Your behavior under pressure has shown people around the world what real dignity looks like." The captain showed William some of the messages that had been pouring in from around the world. Letters from school children, emails from military families, posts from people who had been inspired by his professionalism in the face of such disrespect. "A teacher in Australia used your example to teach her students about self-control," Captain Morrison read from one message. "A father in Canada told his children about how you handled yourself when someone was cruel to you. You've touched more lives than you realize." Meanwhile, Marcus Blackwood was experiencing a very different kind of attention in his London jail cell. The reality of his situation was finally beginning to penetrate his arrogance, helped along by the increasingly frantic calls he was receiving from his business associates. His assistant Jennifer had been given permission to brief him on the business consequences of his actions, and the news was devastating. The Morrison deal, worth over $200 million, had been officially canceled. 3 other major partnerships were under review, and the company's stock price had dropped by 12% in a single day. "How is this possible?" Marcus asked during a phone call with his board of directors. "It was just one incident." Board Chairman David Sterling's voice was cold with barely controlled anger. "Marcus, This wasn't just one incident. This was a display of everything people hate about wealthy Americans abroad. You've become the poster child for entitled behavior, and it's destroying everything we've built. The board meeting that followed was unlike anything in the company's history. Several board members were calling for Marcus's immediate resignation as CEO, while others wanted to explore options for removing him entirely from the company leadership. The brand damage is incalculable, said board member Sarah Williams, a marketing expert who had helped build the company's public image. We're not just talking about lost deals, we're talking about permanent damage to our reputation that could take years to repair. David Sterling was faced with an impossible situation. Marcus was not only the CEO but also the majority shareholder, making it legally difficult to remove him. However, his continued leadership was clearly toxic to the company's future. "Marcus, you need to seriously consider stepping down voluntarily," David said during a private conversation. "It might be the only way to save the company." For the first time in his business career, Marcus was confronted with the possibility that his own actions might cost him control of the empire he had spent decades building. The irony was brutal. The wealth and power that had given him the confidence to behave so badly might be destroyed by that very same behavior. Back in London, Richard Pemberton finally arrived at the police station where Marcus was being held. As one of New York's most expensive lawyers, Richard was accustomed to commanding respect and attention wherever he went. However, the British legal system was unimpressed by his reputation or his fees. "Mr. Pemberton," Detective Inspector Margaret Wells greeted him professionally. "Your client is facing serious charges, and I need to make sure you understand the gravity of the situation." Richard had spent the flight preparing for this conversation. "Inspector Wells, I appreciate the seriousness of the allegations, but I'm confident we can resolve this matter quickly and fairly." Detective Wells had been anticipating this approach. In her experience, expensive American lawyers often assumed they could negotiate their way out of British legal problems. "Mr. Pemberton, I think you should see the evidence before making any assumptions about resolution." She led Richard to a viewing room where the police had compiled all the video evidence from the incident. For the next hour, Richard watched his client's behavior from every conceivable angle, hearing every word he had spoken, seeing every gesture he had made. By the time the viewing session was over, Richard's confidence in a quick resolution had evaporated completely. The evidence was overwhelming, captured in high definition from multiple angles, with clear audio of every word Marcus had spoken. "As you can see," Detective Wells said when the videos ended, "this is not a case that will hinge on witness testimony or interpretation of events. Your client's actions are documented beyond any reasonable doubt." Richard nodded slowly, his legal mind already calculating the challenges ahead. "What is the Crown seeking in terms of resolution?" "That will be up to the Crown Prosecution Service," Detective Wells replied. "But given the public nature of the offense and the level of public interest, I expect they'll want to proceed to trial." The mention of a trial sent a chill through Richard's mind. A trial would mean weeks or months of additional publicity, more videos being played in court, more opportunities for Marcus's behavior to be analyzed and criticized by the global media. When Richard finally met with Marcus in the consultation room, he found his client in a state he had never seen before. Marcus's usual confidence was cracking, replaced by anxiety and confusion about his rapidly deteriorating situation. "Richard, thank God you're here," Marcus said, standing up from his chair. "This whole thing has gotten completely out of hand. I need you to make it go away." Richard sat down across from Marcus and pulled out his files. "Marcus, I've reviewed all the evidence, and I need you to understand something very clearly. This is not going away. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and the public attention makes it impossible for the authorities to ignore." "But you're the best lawyer money can buy," Marcus protested. "You've gotten me out of worse situations than this." "No, Marcus, I haven't," Richard replied firmly. "You've never assaulted a royal guard on video before. You've never created an international incident that's been viewed by millions of people. This is unlike anything either of us has dealt with." Marcus slumped in his chair as the reality of his situation finally began to penetrate his denial. "So what are you telling me? That I'm going to prison?" "I'm telling you that we need to completely change our approach," Richard explained. "Fighting these charges isn't going to work. The evidence is too clear. We need to focus on damage control and minimizing the consequences." Richard pulled out his tablet and showed Marcus some of the news coverage from around the world. "Marcus, you need to see what's happening outside. This story is everywhere, and the public reaction is overwhelmingly negative." As Marcus watched news reports from CNN, BBC, and other major networks, he began to understand that his actions had consequences far beyond anything he had imagined. He was being discussed on talk shows, analyzed by legal experts, and criticized by politicians and celebrities around the world. "How did this happen?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It happened because you forgot that money doesn't give you the right to treat people badly," Richard replied bluntly. "And unfortunately for you, forgetting that lesson in front of a dozen cameras has consequences." The legal consultation that followed was unlike any Richard had conducted in his career. Usually he focused on strategies for winning cases or negotiating favorable outcomes. With Marcus, he found himself explaining basic concepts about respect, dignity, and the limits of wealth and privilege. "The Crown is likely to offer a plea agreement," Richard explained. "If you plead guilty to the assault charge, they might drop the additional charges and recommend a lighter sentence." "A guilty plea?" Marcus was horrified. "That would be admitting I did something wrong." "Marcus, you did do something wrong," Richard said firmly. "You spat on a man who was doing his job, someone who represents centuries of British tradition and honor. The sooner you accept responsibility for that, the sooner we can start rebuilding your life." But Marcus wasn't ready to accept responsibility. Despite everything that had happened, despite the evidence against him, despite the global outrage at his behavior, he still believed that somehow his wealth and connections would save him from real consequences.
"I pay more in taxes than that guard makes in 10 years, Marcus muttered. "This is all blown out of proportion." Richard closed his files and looked at his client with a mixture of frustration and pity.
"Marcus, if you maintain that attitude, you're going to lose everything. Your company, your reputation, your freedom, all of it." As their meeting ended, Richard left the police station with a heavy heart. In 30 years of legal practice, he had never had a client who was so completely unable to understand the consequences of his own actions. Marcus Blackwood had created a perfect storm of legal and public relations disasters, and he seemed determined to make it worse with every decision he made. Outside the police station, reporters were gathering as word spread that Marcus's lawyer had arrived. The story was far from over, and the world was watching to see how justice would be served against a man who had believed himself to be above the law. The Westminster Magistrates' Court had seen many high-profile cases over the years, but the arrival of Marcus Blackwood for his initial hearing created a media circus unlike anything court officials could remember. Dozens of reporters, photographers, and television crews had gathered outside the Victorian building, their equipment creating a maze of cables and cameras that stretched down the street. Detective Inspector Margaret Wells had anticipated the media attention and worked with court security to establish clear protocols for Marcus's arrival. Despite his lawyer's requests for a private entrance, the court insisted on following standard procedures. Marcus would face the same justice system as every other defendant. "This is humiliating," Marcus complained to Richard Pemberton as they sat in the police van that would transport them to court. "Do you see all those cameras out there? This is going to be on every news channel in the world." Richard had spent the previous evening preparing Marcus for this moment, but his client's ability to grasp the seriousness of his situation remained frustratingly limited. "Marcus, the cameras are there because your behavior made international news. This hearing is just the beginning of a process that could take months." Through the small window of the police van, Marcus could see the crowd that had gathered outside the courthouse. Along with the media, there were protesters holding signs supporting the royal guard and criticizing wealthy privilege. One sign particularly caught his attention: "Money can't buy respect." The irony was lost on Marcus, but Richard noticed his client's reaction to the crowd. "Those people represent millions of others around the world who saw what you did," Richard explained. "Your action struck a nerve about inequality and entitled behavior." Inside the courthouse, Magistrate Eleanor Sinclair was preparing for what she knew would be one of the most watched hearings of her career. A veteran of the British legal system with over 20 years of experience, Magistrate Sinclair had built her reputation on fairness, thoroughness, and an absolute refusal to be influenced by external pressures. "I want to make sure we follow every procedure precisely," she told her clerk. "This case will be scrutinized by legal experts around the world, and I want our process to be beyond reproach." The courtroom itself was packed to capacity with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public who had been lucky enough to secure seats. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation as everyone waited for Marcus's first public appearance since his arrest. When Marcus finally entered the courtroom, flanked by security officers and his lawyer, the silence was complete. Photographers were not allowed inside, but sketch artists worked frantically to capture the moment for news organizations around the world. Marcus had always prided himself on his appearance, spending thousands of dollars on custom suits and personal grooming. However, a night in jail had taken its toll. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit was wrinkled, and his face showed the strain of his first encounter with consequences he couldn't buy his way out of. "All rise," called the court clerk as Magistrate Sinclair entered the room. "Court is now in session, the Honorable Magistrate Sinclair presiding." As Marcus stood with everyone else in the courtroom, he was struck by the formal dignity of the British legal system. The rituals, the language, the ceremonial respect for the law. It all reminded him uncomfortably of the traditions he had mocked at Buckingham Palace. "Mr. Blackwood," Magistrate Sinclair addressed him directly, her voice carrying the authority of centuries of British jurisprudence. "You are charged with assault upon a royal guard, contrary to Section 39 of the Criminal Justice Act 1988. How do you plead?" This was the moment Richard had been preparing for. Despite his client's resistance to accepting responsibility, Richard had convinced Marcus that a guilty plea was his only realistic option. The evidence was overwhelming, and fighting the charges would only prolong the media attention and make his eventual punishment more severe. However, as Marcus stood in the dock facing the magistrate, his arrogance reasserted itself. All around him, he saw symbols of authority that his wealth had never been able to influence: the Union Jack, the royal coat of arms, the formal robes of the legal officials. It all represented a system that was judging him, not deferring to him. "Not guilty," Marcus said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. Richard Pemberton felt his heart sink. They had discussed this moment extensively, and Marcus had agreed to plead guilty as part of a strategy to minimize damage. This sudden change of plea threw all their careful planning into chaos. "Mr. Blackwood," Richard whispered urgently, "we discussed this. You agreed to the guilty plea." But Marcus was committed to his decision. In his mind, pleading guilty would be admitting that someone else had power over him, something his ego couldn't accept. He was going to fight, regardless of the consequences. Magistrate Sinclair noted the plea and began explaining the next steps in the legal process. "Blackwood, given the serious nature of these charges and the substantial public interest in this case, I am referring this matter to Crown Court for trial. You will remain in custody pending a bail hearing tomorrow morning." The mention of remaining in custody sent a shock through Marcus that was visible to everyone in the courtroom. In his arrogant planning, he had assumed he would be released immediately after the hearing, regardless of his plea. The reality of spending another night in jail was something he had never considered. "Your Honor," Richard stood quickly, "my client respectfully requests bail pending trial. Mr. Blackwood has significant business interests in the United States and no prior criminal record." Crown Prosecutor James Mitchell, a seasoned attorney who had been assigned to the case, stood to respond. "Your Honor, the Crown opposes bail. Mr. Blackwood has shown a complete disregard for British law and institutions. Given his substantial financial resources, there is a significant flight risk." Magistrate Sinclair considered both arguments carefully. "Given the defendant's resources and the international nature of his business interests, I share the Crown's concerns about flight risk. However, I am willing to consider bail with appropriate conditions." The bail conditions that followed were more restrictive than anything Marcus had ever experienced. He would be required to surrender his passport, report to police daily, remain within the London metropolitan area, and post a bond of £5 million, an amount that even for Marcus represented a significant sum. "£5 million? Marcus whispered to Richard in disbelief. "That's highway robbery. It's designed to ensure you don't flee the country," Richard replied quietly. "And frankly, given your resources, it's probably reasonable." As the hearing concluded and Marcus was led back to custody to await the posting of his bail, the media explosion that followed was immediate and intense. News organizations around the world led with the story of the wealthy American who had pleaded not guilty to assaulting a royal guard. The decision to fight the charges was seen by many as another example of Marcus's arrogance and refusal to accept responsibility for his actions. Legal experts on television and in newspapers universally criticized the strategy, predicting that it would only make his eventual punishment more severe. Meanwhile, the impact on Marcus's business empire continued to accelerate. The board of directors of Blackwood Technologies held another emergency meeting, this time with legal counsel present, to discuss their options for removing Marcus from leadership positions. His decision to fight these charges shows he's completely lost touch with reality, said board chairman David Sterling during a conference call with other board members. We cannot allow his personal legal troubles to destroy the company. The company's stock price had continued to fall, dropping another 8% after news of Marcus's not guilty plea became public. Major clients were canceling contracts, partnerships were being terminated, and several key employees had already submitted their resignations. Sarah Williams, the board member responsible for marketing and public relations, had been monitoring social media and news coverage around the clock. The public reaction is getting worse, not better, she reported. People are angry that he's not taking responsibility for his actions. In London, Guardsman William Matthews was struggling with the continued attention his situation was receiving. The decision to fight the charges meant that he would likely have to testify in court, reliving the humiliation of the assault in front of a global audience. I never wanted any of this, William told his girlfriend Emma during a quiet dinner at his flat. I just wanted to serve with honor and be left alone. Emma had been supportive throughout the ordeal, but she was also worried about the toll the stress was taking on William. You didn't ask for this, but maybe there's a bigger purpose. Maybe your example is helping other people understand the importance of dignity and self-control. Captain Morrison had been working with the palace's legal team to prepare for William's potential testimony. The Royal Guard had never been involved in such a high-profile legal case, and everyone wanted to ensure that William was properly supported through the process. The most important thing is that you tell the truth about what happened, Captain Morrison advised. Don't worry about the media attention or the political implications. Just be honest about your experience. While William prepared for the possibility of testifying, Marcus was discovering that money could not buy him the comfort and control he had always taken for granted. His luxury hotel suite had been replaced by a basic apartment near the courthouse, chosen more for security than comfort. The restrictions of his bail conditions were particularly galling for someone accustomed to unlimited freedom of movement. Having to report to police daily, staying within the London area, and surrendering his passport made Marcus feel trapped in a way he had never experienced. I can't live like this, he complained to Richard during one of their daily strategy sessions. I have business interests around the world. I need to be able to travel. Then you should have thought about that before you assaulted a royal guard, Richard replied bluntly. His patience with Marcus's self-pity was wearing thin, especially since his client continued to refuse to accept responsibility for his actions. The legal strategy sessions were becoming increasingly frustrating for Richard. Marcus insisted on fighting charges that were supported by overwhelming video evidence, refused to show any remorse for his behavior, and seemed incapable of understanding why the public reaction was so negative. Maybe we could argue that the guard provoked me by ignoring me, Marcus suggested during one particularly painful meeting. Richard stared at his client in disbelief. Marcus, he was doing his job. Royal Guards are supposed to ignore distractions. That's literally what they're trained to do. But it was disrespectful, Marcus protested. I was trying to be friendly, and he acted like I didn't exist. You were trying to disrupt a ceremonial duty that represents centuries of British tradition, Richard corrected. And when he properly maintained his post, you assaulted him. There's no way to spin that into his fault. As the trial date approached, it became clear that Marcus's strategy of denying responsibility and fighting the charges was backfiring spectacularly. Instead of generating sympathy or understanding, his continued arrogance was only making the public anger more intense. The case had become a symbol of the broader issues around wealth inequality, privilege, and accountability. Marcus Blackwood had become the face of entitled behavior, while Guardsman William Matthews had become a symbol of dignity under pressure. The stage was set for a trial that would be watched around the world, where a billionaire's sense of entitlement would face the ancient principles of British justice. Marcus had chosen to fight, but he was about to discover that some battles cannot be won with money, and some consequences cannot be avoided through privilege. The wealthy man who had always believed he could buy his way out of any problem was about to face the one thing his money could not purchase: justice. The Old Bailey, officially known as the Central Criminal Court, had witnessed some of the most significant trials in British history. As Marcus Blackwood's case moved to Crown Court, the historic building prepared to host what many were calling the trial of privilege versus dignity. Judge Sir Reginald Thornby, a distinguished jurist with over 30 years of experience, had been assigned to preside over the case. Known for his fairness, sharp intellect, and absolute intolerance for theatrics in his courtroom, Sir Reginald was exactly the type of Judge Marcus should have feared. "This case will be conducted according to the highest standards of British justice," Sir Reginald announced during the pre-trial conference. "I will not tolerate any attempts to turn my courtroom into a media circus, regardless of the public interest in these proceedings." The jury selection process had been particularly challenging due to the global media coverage of Marcus's actions. Finding 12 impartial jurors who hadn't seen the viral videos or formed opinions about the case required careful screening of hundreds of potential candidates. Crown Prosecutor James Mitchell had spent weeks preparing his case, though he privately acknowledged that with such clear video evidence, his job was relatively straightforward. "We have multiple high-definition recordings of the assault from various angles," he explained to his team. "The defendant's own words are captured clearly on audio. This is about as straightforward as a criminal case gets." Richard Pemberton, meanwhile, was facing the most challenging case of his career. His client refused to consider plea negotiations, insisted on maintaining his innocence despite overwhelming evidence, and seemed incapable of understanding why his behavior was wrong. "Marcus, I need you to understand that we're not just fighting the legal charges," Richard explained during their final pre-trial meeting. "We're fighting against video evidence that's been seen by hundreds of millions of people worldwide." Marcus remained defiant. "Those videos don't show the full context. They don't show how disrespectful that guard was to me. I'm a job creator, a taxpayer, someone who contributes to society. I deserve better treatment." Richard had given up trying to make Marcus understand the fundamental flaws in his thinking. Instead, he focused on the only defense strategy that might have any chance of success, arguing that Marcus's behavior, while inappropriate, was the result of stress and cultural misunderstanding rather than criminal intent. On the morning of the trial, the Old Bailey was surrounded by an unprecedented media presence. Journalists from around the world had traveled to London to cover what many were calling the most watched assault trial in British history. Protesters had also gathered, with groups supporting both the Royal Guard and, surprisingly, a small contingent defending Marcus's right to free expression. The courtroom itself was packed to capacity with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public who had secured tickets through a lottery system. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation as everyone waited for the main participants to arrive. When Marcus entered the courtroom, the change in his appearance was striking. The confident, arrogant billionaire who had strutted around Buckingham Palace just months earlier looked haggard and uncertain. The stress of the legal proceedings combined with the collapse of many of his business relationships had clearly taken its toll. Guardsman William Matthews entered the courtroom wearing his dress uniform, a decision made by the palace to emphasize the dignity and honor of the Royal Guard. His bearing was erect, his expression calm and professional, creating a stark contrast with Marcus's obvious discomfort. "All rise," called the court clerk, as Judge Sir Reginald entered. "The Crown Court is now in session, the Honorable Sir Reginald Thornby presiding." Crown Prosecutor Mitchell began his opening statement with calm precision. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about respect, respect for tradition, respect for duty, and respect for human dignity. The evidence will show that the defendant, Marcus Blackwood, deliberately and maliciously assaulted a royal guard who was performing his ceremonial duties." Mitchell walked the jury through the events of that morning at Buckingham Palace, using a large screen to display still images from the various videos. The progression from Marcus's initial arrogance to his ultimate assault on William was laid out in methodical detail. "You will see and hear, in the defendant's own words, his belief that his wealth entitled him to special treatment. You will witness his escalating aggression when that special treatment was not provided. And you will see the moment when that aggression turned into criminal assault. The prosecutor then played the key video evidence, and the courtroom fell silent as Marcus's voice filled the room. Do you know who I am? Rules are for poor people. I can buy and sell all of you. When the video reached the moment of the assault, several jury members visibly recoiled. The image of Marcus spitting on William's pristine uniform was even more shocking in the formal setting of the courtroom than it had been on social media. Richard Pemberton's opening statement faced an impossible task: defending behavior that appeared indefensible. Ladies and gentlemen, my client is not a criminal. He is a successful businessman who made a serious error in judgment during a moment of stress and cultural confusion. Richard argued that Marcus's behavior, while wrong, was the result of jet lag, business pressure, and misunderstanding about British customs, rather than criminal intent. Mr. Blackwood deeply regrets his actions and the pain they have caused. But a momentary lapse in judgment should not be treated as a deliberate criminal act. However, even Richard's skilled presentation couldn't overcome the stark reality of the video evidence. The jury could see and hear Marcus's deliberate escalation, his repeated references to his wealth and status, and his calculated decision to assault William when his other tactics failed. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. Witness after witness testified about what they had seen, each account consistent with the video evidence. Officer James, who had tried to de-escalate the situation, testified about Marcus's complete disregard for authority and his explicit statements about being above the rules. The defendant specifically told me that rules were for poor people, Officer James testified. He made it clear that he believed his wealth entitled him to special treatment and exempted him from normal standards of behavior. Inspector Sarah Chen's testimony was particularly damaging to Marcus's case. As head of Palace Security, her professional assessment carried significant weight with the jury. In 30 years of security work, I have never witnessed such a deliberate and calculated assault on a member of the Royal Guard, she testified. The defendant's behavior was not the result of confusion or stress. It was a deliberate expression of contempt for British institutions and traditions. When Guardsman William Matthews took the stand, the courtroom was completely silent. His testimony was delivered with the same calm professionalism he had shown during the assault itself, but the emotional impact was profound. I felt humiliated and degraded, William testified, his voice steady but clearly emotional. Not just personally, but as a representative of the Royal Guard and everything it stands for. The defendant made it clear that he viewed me as nothing more than a costume, something he could abuse for his entertainment. Richard's cross-examination of William was gentle, focusing on his training and the protocols he followed. However, every question only served to highlight William's professionalism and the deliberate nature of Marcus's assault. You maintained your composure throughout this ordeal, Richard acknowledged. That must have required tremendous self-control. It did, William replied, but that's what we're trained for. We represent something larger than ourselves, and we don't let personal attacks compromise that duty. The defense's case was brief and largely ineffective. Richard called character witnesses who testified to Marcus's business success and charitable donations, but their testimony seemed irrelevant in the face of the video evidence of his behavior. Marcus's own testimony was the most anticipated moment of the trial. Against Richard's strong advice, Marcus insisted on taking the stand to defend himself. It proved to be a catastrophic mistake. Mr. Blackwood, Crown Prosecutor Mitchell began his cross-examination. Do you believe your wealth entitles you to different treatment under the law? Of course not, Marcus replied, though his defensive tone suggested otherwise. Mitchell then played the audio of Marcus's own words. Rules are for poor people. I can buy and sell all of you. Did you say those words, Mr. Blackwood? Marcus squirmed in his chair. I may have said something like that, but it was taken out of context. What context would make those words appropriate when speaking to a police officer? Marcus had no answer that didn't make him sound even more arrogant and entitled. The more he tried to explain his behavior, the worse he appeared to the jury. The prosecution's closing argument was devastating in its simplicity. The evidence is clear and overwhelming. The defendant assaulted a royal guard who was performing his ceremonial duties. He did so deliberately, maliciously, and with complete disregard for British law and tradition. His wealth does not place him above the law, and his behavior that day was criminal. Richard's closing argument was a last desperate attempt to generate sympathy for Marcus. My client made a serious error in judgment, but he is not a career criminal. He is a successful businessman who let stress and confusion cloud his judgment for a few minutes. That does not make him a criminal who deserves imprisonment. However, the jury had heard and seen enough. After just 90 minutes of deliberation, they returned with a verdict that surprised no one who had followed the trial: guilty on all charges. Judge Sir Reginald's sentencing was swift and severe. Mr. Blackwood, your behavior was a deliberate assault on not just Guardsman Matthews, but on the very principles of respect and dignity that underpin civilized society. Your wealth and status, rather than being mitigating factors, actually make your behavior more reprehensible. Marcus was sentenced to 6 months in prison, the maximum allowed under British law for the charges against him. Additionally, he was fined £100,000 and ordered to pay £50,000 in compensation to William Matthews. Perhaps most significantly, he was banned from entering the United Kingdom for 10 years after completing his sentence. As the sentence was read, Marcus's face went white with shock. The reality of spending 6 months in a British prison, away from his luxury lifestyle and business empire, was something he had never truly believed would happen. The global reaction to the verdict was overwhelmingly positive. Social media exploded with celebration as people around the world expressed satisfaction that wealth and privilege had not protected Marcus from the consequences of his actions. #Justice for the Guard began trending worldwide, with millions of people sharing their thoughts about the case. Military veterans, law enforcement officers, and ordinary citizens expressed their appreciation for a legal system that had held a wealthy individual accountable for his actions. The business consequences for Marcus were immediate and severe. Within hours of the verdict, the board of directors of Blackwood Technologies voted unanimously to remove him as CEO and chairman. The company's stock price, which had been struggling throughout the trial, finally began to recover as investors reacted positively to Marcus's removal. "This is a new beginning for our company," announced interim CEO David Sterling. "We can now focus on our business operations without the distraction of Mr. Bears, Blackwood's personal legal troubles." For Guardsman William Matthews, the verdict brought a sense of closure to an ordeal that had lasted for months. The global support he had received had been overwhelming, and he had used his platform to advocate for respect and dignity in public discourse. "I'm grateful that the legal system worked as it should," William said in a statement released through the palace. "This was never about me personally. It was about the principle that everyone, regardless of their wealth or status, should be treated with respect and held accountable for their actions." The case of Marcus Blackwood had become more than just a simple assault trial. It had become a symbol of the ongoing struggle between privilege and accountability, between wealth and dignity, between entitlement and justice. As Marcus began his prison sentence in a standard British correctional facility, sharing cells and common areas with ordinary criminals, he finally began to understand what he had lost through his moment of arrogance. His wealth was still there, but his reputation, his business empire, and his freedom had all been sacrificed on the altar of his own entitled behavior. The rich tourist who had spat on a royal guard had learned the hardest lesson of his life, that money could buy many things, but it could not buy respect. And it certainly could not buy immunity from the consequences of treating others with contempt. In the end, justice had been served not through wealth or privilege, but through the ancient principles of fairness and accountability that had guided British law for centuries. Marcus Blackwood had discovered that some things truly are more valuable than money, and he had lost them all.